Few people know the details about David Payne, one of the names involved in the Madeleine McCann case. But what exactly is known about him and his connection to the disappearance? Today, we will dive into the facts and theories that few discuss, and you will understand why his name raises so many questions. If you are fascinated by stories full of mysteries, like the Madeleine McCann case, and want to uncover the details that few talk about, subscribe to the channel now and activate the notification bell. This way, you won't miss any twists or new theories about this and other cases that will leave you speechless. David Payne, a name that, to many, might just be another piece in the complicated puzzle of the Madeleine McCann case. But the more you look at the details, those that went unnoticed by most, the more questions start to arise. And these are not easy questions to ignore. It all begins with a group of friends on vacation in a setting that should be peaceful. David was among them, seemingly just another friend of the McCann family. But then testimonies and behaviors start to raise suspicions that no one anticipated. And this is where the question arises. What do we really know about David Payne? And more importantly, what has never been said out loud about him? In the first days after Madeleine's disappearance, details emerge that don't seem to fit. Testimonies from witnesses and members of the group of friends, known as the Tapas 7, show contradictions that, instead of clarifying, only increase doubts. One of the statements that draw the most attention is from a particular witness who claimed to have noticed something strange in David's behavior. During dinner at the Tapas restaurant, while everyone was supposedly calm, this witness says they noticed that David seemed excessively nervous, checking his phone every few minutes. And here's a question that no one seemed willing to answer. Why was he so restless if the atmosphere was supposed to be one of camaraderie? Initially, suspicions naturally fell on the McCanns themselves, but soon the circle of suspicion began to expand, and David Payne's name was mentioned more than once. A police report suggests that some of his initial statements seemed to contradict those of other group members. For example, David stated that on that fateful night, he saw Madeleine and the family at the apartment around 7 p.m. He described scenes that, at first glance, seemed like common details of a family routine. But then comes the question. The other testimonies from the group do not mention this visit with such certainty, and some even contradict the time he mentioned. This raises a serious doubt. Was David really there? And if he was, what else might he have seen or done that was not reported? And then we come to an account that makes the story even more tense. A former nanny who worked at a different time for the McCann family revealed in an interview that she always felt there was something strange about David Payne's behavior. She didn't provide many details, but her statement was enough to reignite discussions about his involvement in the case. Here, it's worth pausing for reflection. Were these behaviors just coincidences or, in some way, signaling something deeper, something that has yet to be revealed? Another point that draws attention is the way David responded to police questions. Instead of providing clear answers, he frequently resorted to vague phrases or diverted the subject. A specific example involves the exact time he supposedly left the Tapas restaurant that night. While other group members provide specific times, David's statements remain confusing, almost as if he were trying to buy time to adjust his version of events. And here is an intriguing point. If everything was as simple as a dinner among friends, why so many inconsistencies? David Payne, a name that to many might go unnoticed in such a complex and high-profile case as Madeleine McCann's disappearance. But upon closer observation, Payne's role in the narrative raises more questions than answers. And these questions are not easy to ignore. From his actions on the night of the disappearance to the contradictions in testimonies from close people, everything seems to point to gaps that have yet to be filled. Let's start with what should be simple. David Payne stated that he visited the McCann apartment that night to check if everything was okay with Kate and the children, an action that, in principle, seems completely harmless, even commendable. But looking closer, the account is not so straightforward. Kate McCann did not mention this visit in her initial testimonies. Why would someone omit an interaction that, theoretically, was routine? Was it a simple oversight or something more? Her silence on this detail raised the first red flag. And then we have alive and well during this brief visit to the apartment, which in a way should help outline a timeline. However, this statement created a rupture point, as the chronology of events reported by others does not perfectly align with his. Close friends who were at the Tapas bar that night could not accurately confirm the time of this visit. More than that, Payne's descriptions of what he saw in the apartment seem vague, almost as if he were trying to remember something he didn't actually witness. And it doesn't stop there. Another uncomfortable point arises when we examine third-party reports about Payne's behavior in other contexts. One of the most controversial witnesses in this case was a doctor who traveled with the group on a previous occasion. In a testimony, she stated that she felt uncomfortable with Payne's comments about the children, describing them as inappropriate. These allegations were never fully investigated, but they cast a shadow over his behavior and inevitably make anyone question. Was there something more going on that went unnoticed? The connection between Payne and the McCanns is also something worth considering. He was seen as a close friend, someone the couple trusted. However, during the investigations, details about group dynamics began to emerge. For example, during the trip, Payne seemed to take on an organizer role among the friends, something that, at first glance, seemed to be just due to his personality. But did this leadership role hide something? And what about the Tapas group, which, despite so many inconsistencies in their stories, remained united and cohesive, as if following a combined narrative? Moreover, there is a detail that many forget: Payne's connection with the so-called lost phone. During the investigation, it was discovered that Payne had made calls that night that were never fully traced. One of these calls, interestingly, was to a number that later turned out to belong to someone with a dubious history related to child exploitation. This detail, although it was largely ignored by authorities at the time, remains an unsettling enigma. Was it just a coincidence, or was there something more to this call? And then there's his behavior after Madeleine's disappearance. Unlike other group members, Payne seemed particularly eager to control certain narratives. He was one of the first people to suggest that Madeleine might have been kidnapped, something that, interestingly, aligned with the McCann's official version very early on. Why would someone make such a specific assumption in such a chaotic moment? And more importantly, how was he so sure that Madeleine couldn't have simply left the apartment on her own? Meanwhile, the media, which initially focused exclusively on Madeleine's parents, began to sideline Payne in their coverage. But on the internet, theorists and independent investigators started connecting dots that seemed to have been ignored. Why were his actions not investigated more deeply? He was questioned by the police, but never became a formal suspect, even with so many doubts hovering over his statements and behavior. Could this be the result of a poorly conducted investigation, or were there other forces protecting David Payne? Another point that cannot be ignored is the impact of the absence of concrete evidence. In such cases, what is not said often speaks louder than what is said. And with Payne, the silences, narrative deviations, and omitted details create a fragmented image that, in itself, raises suspicions. This is not about accusing without proof, but about understanding why so many pieces of this puzzle continue not to fit. Meanwhile, the Madeleine McCann case remains a mystery. Payne continues to be a peripheral figure in this story, someone who, despite being so close to the events, seems to carry more questions than answers. And perhaps it is precisely this ambiguity that makes his role so intriguing and so frustrating. After all, when you look at the details, it becomes clear that Madeleine's case is not just about what happened that night, but also about what was not properly investigated. Will we one day know the complete truth about David Payne and his connection to Madeleine's disappearance? Maybe, but for now, all we can do is piece together the available information and continue questioning what is still behind the curtains. David Payne, one of the names frequently associated with the Madeleine McCann case, continues to be an enigmatic figure. Now, as we delve deeper into the evidence and theories, we reach a point that not only challenges the official narrative, but also reveals nuances that many preferred to ignore. One of the first theories that caused a stir was regarding Payne's visit to the McCann apartment on the night of the disappearance. As mentioned, he claimed to have checked if everything was okay with the timeline. However, when we analyze the accounts, we notice something strange. Not all the friends present at the Tapas bar that night mentioned this visit clearly, and Kate McCann, in her initial testimonies, did not detail it either. This raises an uncomfortable question. Why was such a relevant event omitted or treated vaguely? Was it a memory lapse, or is there something more to this story? And there is a detail that makes everything even more confusing. Payne stated that he saw Madeleine alive during his visit, describing her as calm and apparently ready to sleep. But here's the problem. The times and details of this brief interaction do not perfectly align with other group testimonies. This casts a shadow over the accuracy of his account, especially considering the weight this information holds in the context of the case. Another point that draws attention is the testimony of a doctor, a friend of the group on another trip, who stated that she felt uncomfortable with Payne's comments about children. She even classified them as inappropriate. but the investigation never gave due attention to this statement. This creates an additional layer of doubt about Payne's behavior, leading many to question whether these reports could indicate something deeper or if they are just misunderstandings amplified by the context. As we move forward, theories emerge involving Payne's connections with other suspicious figures. A detail that rarely gets highlighted is a call made by Payne that night to a number that was later associated with an individual with a dubious history related to child exploitation. Although this connection was never thoroughly explored by authorities, it remains an enigma that cannot be ignored. Was it just a coincidence? Or does this call reveal a layer of the case that was never properly investigated? Additionally, there is a question hanging over the group as a whole. From the beginning, the McCann's friends, including Payne, showed remarkable cohesion in their testimonies. However, this unity also raises suspicions. With so many inconsistencies in the versions presented, it seems there was a deliberate effort to keep the narrative aligned. Payne, in particular, took an active role in this process, being one of the first to suggest that Madeleine had been kidnapped. But how could he be so sure of this so early on? Was it a simple instinct or something more planned? And Payne's behavior after the disappearance also deserves attention. He seemed excessively concerned with controlling certain narratives, especially in the press. His demeanor was that of someone who knew more than he was willing to reveal. For example, in interviews, he avoided directly answering questions that could compromise his position. This attitude raised suspicions, not only among case theorists, but also among some independent investigators. Meanwhile, new evidence emerges, connecting Payne to events that continue to defy the case's logic. One involves the analysis of communication data, showing that Payne made several calls on the night of the disappearance, but not all could be traced. Some of these calls, made to unidentified numbers, remain a mystery to this day. Why were these pieces of information not fully investigated? The official narrative also fails to explain why Payne, who seemed to be a central figure in the events of that night, was never investigated more deeply. His proximity to the McCanns and his role in the Tapas group should, in theory, place him under more rigorous scrutiny. But on the contrary, he remained on the margins of the main investigations, as if protected by an invisible barrier. Among the most disturbing theories is the possibility that Payne knew more than he admitted about what happened that night. Some independent investigators have hypothesized that he might have had crucial information that was never revealed, either out of fear or loyalty to the group. These suspicions are reinforced by his insistence on avoiding specific details about his role that night, opting for generic answers that contributed little to the advancement of the investigation. And then we reach the most intriguing point. Why was David Payne never investigated as a formal suspect, even with so many unanswered questions? Could this reflect a poorly conducted investigation, or are there greater forces at play protecting his name? Meanwhile, doubts continue to grow, and Payne remains a figure who, despite being at the center of events, seems to carry more mysteries than answers. David Payne emerges as a figure surrounded by mystery and unanswered questions in the Madeleine McCann case. From the beginning, his participation was essential in shaping the narrative. But there are details that, when closely observed, has brought us here. And it is time to unveil the discovery that completely changes how this case is perceived. One of the most surprising revelations is found in an official document, a statement made by a couple of doctors who traveled with Payne on another occasion. They stated in testimony to the police that certain comments he made about children were deeply unsettling, to the point of being classified as inappropriate. Although these statements never resulted in direct actions against Payne, they cast a shadow over his behavior. After all, what would motivate someone to make such comments, especially in such a sensitive context? Furthermore, Payne was one of the last people to see Madeleine alive, according to his own account. He stated that he had visited the McCann apartment that night to check if everything was okay with Kate and the children. This alone puts his name at the center of the events. But what really stands out is that not all the friends from the Tapas 7 group confirmed this visit with the same clarity. Why is that? Was it a simple memory error? Or is there something more that was not revealed? And as if that weren't enough, the timings don't match. Payne described Madeleine as calm and already ready to sleep, but the information about the girl's last moments indicates inconsistencies. If he was really there, why don't such basic details align? This discrepancy creates a void in the narrative, and it is precisely in this void that the biggest suspicions arise. Another point that cannot be ignored is his behavior in the days and weeks following Madeleine's disappearance. While most of the McCann's friends seemed hesitant to deal with the media, Payne took a more active role, helping to reinforce the idea of a kidnapping. This might seem altruistic, but for some case critics, it raised suspicions. After all, why was he so invested in controlling the public narrative? And why did he seem so sure that Madeleine had been taken by someone? But there is something even more intriguing: a series of calls made by Payne on the night of the disappearance. Among these calls, one stands out that was later associated with a person with a dubious history involving crimes against children. This connection, although never deeply explored by authorities, is one of the most disturbing pieces of this puzzle. Coincidence, or a sign of something much bigger? And as if these points were not enough to create doubts, Payne was never investigated as a formal suspect. Despite being present in almost all key moments of the case, he remained on the fringes of the main investigations. Why? Is this a reflection of a failure in handling the case, or are there greater forces at play? This lack of in-depth analysis of his participation raises an unsettling question. How many answers could be hidden behind this omission? And finally, we reach the most revealing point. A confidential investigation report mentions that, among the contradictory testimonies of the Tapas 7 group, Payne's is one of the most divergent. This information, which should have put a spotlight on him, was ignored. Why were his contradictions not thoroughly investigated? And more importantly, what does this mean for the search for the truth? These questions not only challenge the official narrative, but also reopen debates about how the investigations were conducted. Payne may not be guilty, but his role is far from simple or innocent. And as long as these questions remain unanswered, the Madeleine McCann case will continue to be one of the greatest mysteries of recent history. David Payne emerges as an intriguing and controversial character in the Madeleine McCann case, but it is impossible to ignore the inconsistencies and gaps surrounding his involvement. What strikes me the most is how details that should be crucial, timings, statements, and even the posture of other involved parties, seem to fall into a limbo of uncertainties. This leaves a hammering question. How did such a widely investigated case manage to leave so many loose ends, especially about someone so close to the center of the story? My opinion is clear. Payne should have been investigated more thoroughly. The contradictions in his testimony and the inexplicable events around him cannot be treated as mere coincidences. I am not saying that he is guilty of something specific, but his involvement demands answers that have yet to surface. This reinforces the feeling that the handling of this case was marked by flaws that may have prevented the truth from emerging. And what does this say about the case itself? With each new piece we add to the puzzle, it seems we are dealing not only with the disappearance of a child, but with a plot that mixes errors, secrets, and possibly cover-ups. There is still much to be uncovered. If you have made it this far, comment, "I am a truth seeker," so we know you watched. Do you think Payne's actions were analyzed as they should have been? Or was there negligence? Oh, and don't leave now, because in the next video we will delve into another essential element of this case, something that directly connects Payne to an aspect often ignored in the official narrative. You will definitely want to watch. If you enjoyed this content and want to follow more in-depth investigations like this one, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss anything. And of course, leave your topic suggestions in the comments. Your participation is essential to continue bringing stories that challenge the official versions. See you in the next video.